Before you can critique an ideology, you have to be able to define it properly. One of the biggest intellectual mistakes in modern discourse is collapsing all forms of feminism into one category. Liberal feminism, which focuses historically on legal equality such as voting rights and property rights, is really not the same as radical feminism. Radical feminism, emerging prominently in the late 1960s and 1970s, makes a far broader claim. It argues that patriarchy, defined as systematic structure in which men as a class dominate women as a class, is really the root cause of female oppression across institutions, whether that be family, law, economics, culture, or sexuality. And this is an odd claim. An odd claim should be tested, okay? So radical feminist theory suggests that society is structured to benefit men at women's expense. Not that perhaps men created the society to benefit us and built it for us. So the first place to examine this is measurable outcomes in modern developed nations. According to OECD data, women now outnumber the men in education enrollment across most Western countries. In the United States, women have earned the majority of bachelor's degrees every year since the early 1980s. As of 2022, women earned approximately 57% of bachelor's degrees and nearly 60% of master's degrees, and that data is from National Centre for Education Statistics. In the UK, women represent roughly 58% of university students. If patriarchy structurally restricts women's advancements in education, the current data does not support that claim anymore. So, moving on to employment. In employment participation, women's labour forced participation in OECD countries has risen dramatically over the last 50 years. In the US, it rose roughly from 43% in 1970s, 43% in 1970s, to around 57% pre-pandemic. And that's only going higher. It's not going lower. And that data is from Bureau of Labor Statistics. In the European Union, female labor force participation now averages above 67%. It's real life data. In political representation, women hold approximately 28% of parliamentary seats globally, a number that continues to rise steadily. None of these data suggests legal exclusion for women. Radical feminism often shifts from legal inequality to outcome inequality. For example, my favorite, the gender pay gap. According to the United States Bureau of Statistics, I believe that data is from 2023, women working full-time earn approximately 82 to 84 cents on the dollar compared to men in median weekly earnings. However, if we consider occupation, the hours worked, years of experience, and industry, the adjusted gap narrows substantially. Studies such as those published by the American Association of University Women and analysis using data from the US Department of Labor indicate that a portion of the gap remains unexplained, but the large portion of that gap really is down to the occupation, work hour differences, and career interruptions, particularly related to childbirth. So once again, we are comparing women and men when they have to make different choices. Those are not bad choices. Raising your family and having children is a beautiful choice that any of us can make or not make. That's fine too. But the problem begins where you're saying that men are getting paid more, but you're not making the same choices. So you can't expect the same outcome making a different choice. And that distinction of a childbirth really matters. If a gap is caused entirely by discrimination, fine. That implies systematic structural oppression. If a gap is influenced by a complex mix of career choices, biological factors, hours worked, and caregiving interruptions, then the narrative becomes more nuanced, okay? For example, Pew Research Center in 2023 reported that women are significantly more likely than men to reduce hours and step out of workforce due to caregiving responsibilities. This is not necessarily oppression, it's really a mix of economic and social factors. Radical feminist theory also critiques traditional family structures as reinforcing male dominance, but long research on family stability really complicates that claim. According to the data from the US Census Bureau and multiple long-term research studies summarized by institutions such as Brookings Institution and the Institute for Family Studies, children raised in stable two-parent households on average demonstrate better educational outcomes, lower poverty rates, and lower rates of criminal offenses when they become adults. This does not mean that all two-parent households are healthy or that single parents cannot raise thriving children. It really means that stability directly correlates strongly with measurable outcomes. And we all know this by now. If the nuclear family were purely an instrument of oppression, one would expect its presence to correlate negatively with well-being indicators. So the data does not support that across most measurable metrics. Yet another central claim within radical feminist culture is thought that patriarchy privileges men by category, okay? Yet when examining risks exposure, a different pattern appears. Men account for approximately 93% of workplace fatalities in the United States. Men are overrepresented in high-risk occupations such as construction, mining, logging, and military combat roles. Globally, men have higher suicide completion rates. In many Western countries, male suicide rates are roughly 3 to 4 times higher than female rates. Men represent the majority of prison populations worldwide. If patriarchy operates as a uniform system of male benefits, these differences require explanation. One possible response is that patriarchy harms men too, but that reframes the original claim from the radical feminism. It suggests that systems are complex and that gender outcomes cannot be reduced to a simple oppressor-oppressed binary roles. Radical feminism often treats gender differences as primarily socially constructed, while social norms really undeniably influence behavior. Cross-cultural research complicates the idea that gender preferences are purely social artifacts. Studies examining occupational preferences across countries with higher gender equality show that gender differences in career preferences often remain or even widen in more modern societies. This phenomenon has been referred to as the gender equality paradox. In societies with more choice of freedom, men and women sometimes diverge more strongly into different fields, with women disproportionately represented in health and education sectors, and men disproportionately represented in engineering and physical sciences. That finding itself does not prove biology is destiny, but it challenges the assumption that all gendered outcome differences are evidence of systematic oppression. Another area of debate involves safety and violence. Women are disproportionately affected by certain forms of violence, particularly sexual violence. This is well documented, we all know this. At the same time, men are disproportionate victims of homicide globally. Violence patterns are complex and they often correlate more strongly with socio-economic instability than with simple gender power narrative. Simplifying violence into a one-directional power model really ignores the significant nuisance around it. It is also important to address mental health trends. According to data from the CDC and similar agencies all across Europe, rates of anxiety and depression have risen significantly among young women in the last decade. That does not automatically suggest feminism. Correlation is not the cause. It does raise questions about whether contemporary cultural expectations like career intensity, social media pressures, or delayed family formation are the major contributing factors, in my opinion. These pressures, they intersect with economic realities such as rising housing costs and student debt burdens. The dual income household has become economically normative in many countries, but not necessarily because of the ideology, but because of cost of living structures. The economic shift deserves real analysis beyond the slogans. The point here really is not to deny that women faced historical discrimination. They really did. The point here is to examine whether radical feminist framing patriarchy as a system of male dominance adequately explains present-day data in developed societies. A robust theory should account for all evidence, not just selective evidence. In many Western nations today, women have legal equality, strong educational representation, increasing political participation, and expanding economic presence. Gender disparities remain in certain sectors, but disparities alone do not automatically prove systematic oppression. They may result from a mix of biological differences, cultural norms, personal preferences, economic structures, and historical momentum. When an ideology shows every outcome gap as evidence of oppression and every disagreement as misogyny, it becomes resistant to falsification. In philosophy of science, a theory that cannot be tested or challenged loses explanatory power. That is not an attack, it is a method of observation. You can support women's rights, advocate fairness, and oppose discrimination without subscribing to a totalizing narrative of gender war. You can acknowledge that women face specific situations where they are vulnerable, while also acknowledge that men face specific vulnerabilities as well. You can critique cultural pressures without reducing society to a conspiracy of domination. What really concerns me personally is not the existence of feminist thought. It is the rigidity that sometimes accompanies radical strands of it. The framing of dissent as moral failure rather than intellectual disagreement. If the evidence is strong, it does not need emotional enforcement. The conversation about gender should be grounded in data, long term studies, cross cultural research, and open debate, not slogans as we are experiencing right now. If radical feminism claims that patriarchy explains the structure of society, then it must contend with modern data showing women's advancements, men's vulnerabilities, complex occupational sorting, and nuanced family outcomes. If it cannot incorporate that evidence without collapsing into contradiction, then it may need refinement. And refinement is not betrayal, it is progress.